Hello and welcome to the channel. Today what we're going to talk about is parsing Omni Channel operating hours messages using Power Automate. Let's go. So a little bit about why this episode is important. So if those of you that may not be familiar, there's a system called Dynamics 365 Omni Channel. It's part of like the support experience for Dynamics. And part of that capability is live agent handoff. And so there's this integration between PVA and Omni Channel OC that allows you to deflect to a chatbot to try to service someone's request. Obviously, if you can service someone using a chatbot instead of a person, that's a good value prop from that perspective. But naturally, there's going to be, some things that just need to be escalated to a live agent, and you can go ahead and do so. Now, there is a feature called operating hours where a company can go ahead and define what are the hours that these live agents are working. And so, sometimes you may not be working 24/7. So you don't want to escalate a conversation to a live person that's not working. And so what you can do is you can query this calendar inside of Omni Channel, and you can go ahead and retrieve sort of what are the operating hours, and then have some logic inside of Power Automate that allows you to detect whether or not you can go ahead and escalate to the live agent or not. And so ran into a little bit of a situation this past week with a customer where we found that the messages that you get with operating hours when you call the API, they can be out of order. Like there's two records that come back, and that can make it problematic when determining whether or not to go ahead and escalate or not. So I went ahead and built a flow that will help parse this information so that we can detect the correct operating hours or the most recent just through some logic itself. Now, even if you don't work with OC, but you're curious about how you can go ahead and parse JSON with Power Automate, this video will still be for you. We won't be talking too much about OC. It'll be more about how do we do this inside of Power Automate and how can we parse. So probably some things that you can learn along the way. So let's go ahead and let's jump into more details. Okay, so I don't have an OC instance anymore, so I'm just going to work off of the sample messages that I received to demonstrate what's going on here. So what can happen when we have an hours of operation request is that we end up seeing the hours of operation for the current date. And this is going to be in universal time, so that's why you see it spanning into the next day itself. And then what we also see is like the previous day's hours of operation. Now, under normal circumstances, this is good. We can go ahead and just rely on the first node containing the hours of operation for the current day. However, what we learned was that if you go ahead and update the hours of operation, that they can get flipped. So a good example of what might happen is that in OC, you can go ahead and set like a recurrence. And let's say like you have a recurrence and it's every day from, say 5 a.m. to 5 p.m. my contact center is going to be open. Now, but if you go ahead and override one of those days, perhaps you've got like a stat holiday or something like that, what you'll find is that the node that would typically be the current day goes from the starting or the first node location to the second. And so that's where we want to be able to detect and find what the current day is. Now, I'm recording this on February 12th. So here, this would be the current day. This would be yesterday. In this node, this would be the current day. This would be yesterday. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and look for the start date and see if it matches the current day. If it does, we'll go ahead and grab the first node here. If it doesn't, we're going to go ahead and grab the second node. So let's go ahead, let's do a demo and explore this a little bit further. Okay, so remember from the slides, the whole scenario here is that we've got a node, we've got a 2 record result set essentially. We've got an array of these nodes. And today's the 12th, February 12th. So we want to be able to go ahead and retrieve these 2 values when the start date is equal to the current date. And the problem is that these can be flipped around. So what we need to do is we need to be able to check for the first node to see if this is today's date. If it is, great, we're going to go ahead and use this data, and we're going to populate a start date variable and an end date variable. Now, in the event that these are flipped and the second node contains today's date, then what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to detect that, and we'll go ahead and grab these two attributes if they represented today's date. And so what I've got here is I've got a flow, and I'm going to have a position, and basically this just allows me to toggle, which scenario I want to test. So I've got a variable that represents the payload. Now, if I pass in 1 for my position, I'll go ahead and use a file that represents, or a payload that represents the first node having today's date. Otherwise, I'll load a payload that has today's date in the second node itself. And as I mentioned before, these are the dates that I want, or the values I want to get out and return, so that I could do a check in PVA that says, okay, are we actually, less than, are we actually still within operating hours or not? And that's kind of the core goal of all of this. So in order to do that, I want to go ahead and get the current time. Now, as I was actually recording this, I actually re-recorded it because I realized something. It's currently 4:30 p.m. here on the 12th, and soon it will be 5 o'clock. And as soon as it turns 5 o'clock in UTC time, it'll be the next day. So it forced me to think about how I need to convert the current date time from UTC time over to Mountain, which is the time zone that I'm in right now. And then I can choose my format string. So what this will do is it'll give me the current time in Mountain Zone now, assuming I have OC and I've got live agents, they're working in Mountain Zone. So if you're in a different time zone, naturally you need to change that. So what I'm going to do is, in order to facilitate comparisons, I'm going to go ahead and just do a substring on the first 10 leftmost alphanumeric characters from our converted time zone itself. So our date, even when it's returned from this specific action, it's going to look something like this. And so when we say go get me the left 10 basically characters, alphanumeric, we're going to go ahead and grab these two. We've got the dashes here as well. So we're going to have what is the current date in our local time zone. Then we're going to go ahead and check that position, right? So all this has to do is which of the scenarios do I want to load in and assign to this variable message payload. So if I pass in a 1 here, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to load essentially this payload, which represents today having the current date in the first node. Now, otherwise, if we provide some other value, we're going to see that yesterday's date is loaded in the first node and that the current date is loaded in the second node. And so that's really what we have to do here, is we have to figure out which one contains to the start date that matches today, and then load the remaining data from that perspective. So I've got a parse JSON here. So we're going to take the payload that was assigned to that variable in the previous step. We're going to generate from sample. So I can provide a sample in here just to get a structure, which allows us to go ahead and parse the information. Now, here what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and do a substring on the first node in our message payload variable, and then grab the 10 leftmost alphanumerics. So in this context, right, we're going to go ahead, we're going to load up this message. We're then going to go ahead and get the first record. So we're going to go ahead and get this record. And then what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and grab the start attribute. And then we're going to go grab the first 10 characters, alphanumeric characters, right? So that's what we're going to do by using this specific expression. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to check the variable current date, which we had assigned up here, right? After we went ahead and got our time zone, right? We have the date captured here. We're going to do a comparison between this value and that current date. And if they're equal, then we know that we've got kind of our proper scenario where we're going to find our start date and our end date in our first node. So once again, we'll go ahead and grab these two values itself. Now the expression we use here is this first. So when you use first and you basically pass in an array, what it's going to do is just go ahead and grab the first record. So it's going to go ahead, grab this first record here. Then what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and pick off that start attribute here. And in this case, we want the entire value. We don't want the first 10. We want to know also what the time is as well. So that's something we'd have to factor into all of this as well. Then what we'll do here is something similar for the end. So we'll once again go get the first node from this specific array. Then we'll go ahead and pick off the end attribute, and then we'll go ahead and grab this entire value. And then we can go ahead and check to see the current time and does it match up as well. And we could sort of deal with that as well. Now, that's kind of the first scenario. The second scenario is we would go ahead and we will compare the start date from the second record. Now, you might see that there's a 1 there, result, then brackets 1. That's because it's a zero-based array. So it's really our second record. Same idea, go ahead and grab the value, but in this case, we'd be going ahead and grabbing this value here, right? We can go ahead and get the start attribute from the second record. So we'd be going and grabbing this value over here. And if it does line up, great. We're then going to go ahead and grab the data from the second nodes. So here, the expression is a little bit different. Before we could use that first expression on that array. Here, what we're going to go ahead and do is say, load up the array, and then go ahead, find the result, basically array here. And then what we're going to do is pass in an index. We'll pass in an index of 1, and then we'll go grab the start value. And then similarly, we do the same thing except for end. We'll go ahead and grab the end attribute itself. Now, here, if you don't have a match, really something funky is going on, right? But that's where you'd want to have some sort of error handling to sort of detect that. So let's go ahead, let's run this, and then we can see, hopefully this is a little bit more clear when you see this running in real time here. So we're going to just do the first scenario first. So we'll go ahead, we'll run this. We'll go get the current time zone. So here we can see that it's, the 12th, and it's been converted to mountain. And then we're just going to go ahead and store that value here of the 12th. Then we're going to go ahead and check to see does the value that we plucked off or in this case, we're going to go ahead and see is the position 1. So we're going to go ahead and load the payload where the current date is in the first record itself. Then we're going to go ahead and parse it. So now we've got some structure. We're going to go extract the first date from the first node, and we'll see that that's today's date, and that the current date equals the date from the first node, so that's great. And then we'll go ahead and extract the value here. So we can see we've got the 12th, and we have the 13th because of the UTC time from that perspective. So that is working as expected. Now let's go ahead and run the other scenario through. So we'll just put a value of 2 here. So that will run. In this case, we're going to go ahead and load the data where our second node contains our data, like for our start date, right? So here, this is from yesterday. So we'd want to go ahead and grab this record because that represents the 12th. And so that's great. So we'll go ahead, we'll load that message in so that we can parse it. We'll extract the first date to see if it matches. It won't because that's going to because it loaded it from the first node and it's going to be false. And so then what we're going to want to do is go ahead and extract the second node. We'll see it equals the 12th. And then that lines up. The current date equals the start date from the second record. And then we can go ahead and pluck that off and deal with it from that perspective. So yeah, that's the demo. Once again, if you're not interested in OC, hopefully you learned some things just about parsing in this video. All right, that concludes another episode on the channel. Like, subscribes, comments, always welcome. If you're not following me on Twitter, go ahead and find me at Weare. Thanks, and we'll see you again soon on the channel.